I need a strong daughter and she needs a home. But that fateful pact turned into a love that defied even death. Stay until the end, you won't believe what they built together. Stay with me and you'll hear how God turned hardship into a love worth keeping. So if you'd like to hear more heartfelt Wild West tales like this one, make sure to subscribe so I can share them with you every day. And if you're ready to ride into this story with me, give this video a like and drop the number 1 in the comments so I'll know you're in the saddle ready for the J. Now let us ride back to the dust-choked plains where the sun bleeds over the horizon and a lone nun walks into danger she never expected. Orny. And it all began the night the convent burned, when Alara stood alone among the ruins and a shadow larger than life stepped out of the smoke. Charred timbers jutted from the blackened earth like the ribs of some giant creature picked clean by fire and wind. The bell, once the convent's proudest sound, lay cracked and twisted in the ashes. Alara stood barefoot in the soot, her habit singed to gray rags, her hands empty. Her breath carried the taste of smoke. Behind her the horizon stretched wide and merciless, Wyoming plains in late autumn, bare and sharp as broken glass. Her faith had taught her to kneel when the world turned cruel, but her knees wouldn't bend now. She was hollow. Not in prayer, but in purpose. That's when the shadow fell over her. At first she thought the sun had dipped behind a cloud. Then she looked up and saw him. Silas Callahan. The man was a mountain in boots, shoulders as broad as a wagon beard, thick and untamed eyes like iron darkened by weather and years. He stood with a stillness that felt heavier than the wreckage around them, a man built from stone and silence. The wind tugged at the long coat draped across his massive frame, and the smoke behind him curled like a cloak of ghosts. "I heard the convent burned," he said, voice low, practical. "Didn't figure anyone survived." Alara said nothing. Her throat ached, her words lost somewhere between grief and disbelief. Silas studied her, not unkindly, but without softness either. Then, as if he were stating the time of day, he spoke the sentence that would rewrite both their lives. "I need a daughter," he said. Her brow furrowed. She thought she had misheard. He didn't waver. "A son don't inherit the same way. A girl, she keeps land, keeps blood. My name's got no one left to carry it. I need a girl child, and you?" He gestured at the ashes at a ruined home, "Need a roof." The bluntness of it cut sharper than a blade. Alara stiffened. "You speak of a contract, a marriage," he answered. His tone held no romance, no plea, only fact. Paper signed, house food work, no ribbons, no lies. "I'll give you a life, you give me a daughter to outlive us both." Ilara's hands trembled at her sides. She wanted to tell him no, wanted to cling to whatever was left of her vows. But the convent was gone. The sisters were gone. God himself felt distant in the smoke, and the prairie did not forgive women alone. Her silence stretched. Silas reached into his coat, pulled out a folded paper, and set it on the edge of a scorched stone. "Sun sets in 4 hours," he said. "That's how long you've got." Then he turned and walked away, leaving footprints deep as craters in the soot. By sundown, Alara rode beside him. She hadn't wept. There were no tears left to give. She carried only the habit on her back and a rosary half melted in her pocket. Each clop of his horse's hooves was an oath she hadn't spoken, an answer she hadn't truly chosen. Yet she followed, because survival leaves little room for dreams. The Callahan ranch loomed larger than she'd imagined. Stone walls, weathered barns, acres of grassland browning for winter. Fences stretched like ribs across the plain. It looked less like a home than a fortress, the kind of place a man built not for comfort but to keep the world out. Silas dismounted, tying the reins with one hand. "You'll sleep inside. Guest room till we say vows. We'll keep it simple." Alara slid down carefully, her knees weak. She glanced at him, half expecting some shred of courtesy, an arm to steady her, a word of welcome. None came. He had already moved toward the porch, heavy steps on wooden planks. Inside the house smelled of stone dust and old leather. Cold. Empty. She saw no flowers, no curtains, no hint of laughter. A man's dwelling, functional and bare, with only the essentials to keep life breathing. That night she lay on a narrow bed, staring at the ceiling beams. She repeated silent prayers, not for deliverance, but for courage. Out the window, the land stretched wide, cruel, endless. In her heart, she wondered if she had stepped from one ruin into another. The wedding came with little more ceremony than the signing of cattle papers. 2 days later, a preacher from town, thin man, shoulders hunched, as if always apologizing, stood beneath the frame of a weathered arch. He owed Silas favors, and he paid them here. There were no guests save the wind, no music but the caw of a distant crow. Silas wore his work shirt clean only because it had been washed in the creek that morning. Ilara wore black, the last garment the fire had not eaten. She looked less like a bride than a mourner, and in truth perhaps she was both. "Do you take this man?" the preacher asked softly. "I do," Ilara said, her voice steady, though her hands trembled. "Do you take this woman?" Silas looked at her for one long second. His gaze was not tender, but it was unwavering. "I do." The preacher cleared his throat, muttered a prayer, and tied their hands with a strip of cloth. "What God joins, let no man put asunder." The wind carried the words away before they even settled. The town whispered. "Giant bought himself a nun," someone muttered at the mercantile. "She's desperate or she's lost her mind," another sneered. "A saint fallen into a bear's den," they laughed. Silas heard it. He didn't care. Ilara heard it too, each word like a pebble thrown at her back. She lifted her chin and said nothing. At the ranch, life began not as love, but as labor. Silas woke before dawn, his bulk bent under the weight of fence posts and harnesses. He worked the cattle, the soil, the axe. He was strength-made, flesh, sweat, and calluses and grit. Ilara tended the house. She swept the stone floors, lit the hearth, boiled stews thick enough to carry a man through winter. She patched worn blankets, stitched shirts, and later planted a small garden where weeds had claimed the earth. She spoke softly to the animals, her calm hands healing where Silas's strength could not. They rarely spoke. Their words were rationed like sugar in a famine. Yet sometimes in the hush of evening, Silas would pause at the doorway, watching her by lamplight as she mended cloth. And sometimes Ilara, in the quiet of prayer, would hear the steady thud of his boots on the porch and feel strangely less alone. It was not affection, not yet. But it was survival, and sometimes survival is the beginning of something greater. Love had not yet arrived at the Callahan Ranch. But respect, quiet, awkward, and stubborn, was beginning to take root like the first green blade pushing through winter frost. Ilara had expected the silence to weigh on her. Instead, she found herself listening to it, hearing the rhythm of Silas's hammer on wood, the rasp of the saw, the grunt of cattle. Each sound was steady, dependable. She came to know him by his labor more than by his words, and in turn Silas began to notice her. The way she tended the garden he had long given up on. The way her hands, delicate yet unflinching, set broken tools straight, dressed a sick calf, or carried buckets without complaint. He'd taken her for fragile once, a woman in black robes surviving by accident. But no fragile soul could stand against the Wyoming wind as she did, eyes lifted, jaw set, as if daring the land to break her. Still, they lived like strangers under one roof until the first test arrived. It was late spring when Cade Holt rode up. Silas had been out mending the north fence, sweat running down his broad back, when Ilara heard the whistle of a horse she didn't know. She stepped out onto the porch apron dusted with flour. The man was lean, with a smile that showed more teeth than warmth. His coat was fine for this country, his boots polished, his hat cocked, as if tilted by arrogance rather than wind. "Well now," Cade drawled, swinging down from his horse. His eyes raked over her. "Didn't think the great Silas Callahan would stoop to buying himself a bride, and a holy one at that." Ilara stiffened, clutching the apron's edge. She didn't answer. Years in the convent had taught her silence could be armor. Cade grinned wider. "What's the matter, sister? Lost your tongue along with your convent?" The barn door creaked open. Silas stepped out, towering dirt still on his hands from the fence line. He said nothing at first, just walked until he stood between Cade and Ilara. His shadow fell across her solid, immovable. "That's my wife you're talking to," Silas said, voice low as rolling thunder. Cade blinked, then smirked. "Wife, you call that a marriage? Whole town says it's a contract at best." Silas's jaw tightened. He didn't raise his fists. He didn't need to. He simply stood, shoulders squared, gaze locked, the kind of presence that made a man feel smaller by the second. "You best ride on," Silas said. For a moment, Cade looked like he might laugh. Then he caught the look in Silas's eyes and decided against it. With a scoff, he mounted up, spurred his horse, and left a trail of dust in his wake. Only when the sound faded did Silas turn his head slightly. "You all right?" Elara nodded, though her pulse still raced. That night, for the first time since their vows, Silas came to her room. He didn't speak of Cade, didn't speak of fear. He simply sat on the edge of her bed, shoulders slumped as though carrying a burden heavier than the land itself. And when she reached out, hesitant, trembling, and placed her hand over his, he did not pull away. The closeness that followed wasn't born of passion but of need, two souls clinging together against the world's cruelty. When dawn broke, the distance between them had lessened. In the weeks that followed, words began to slip into their silence. They were not the words of lovers yet, but of survivors. While patching a wagon wheel, Silas muttered, "Strength's the only way through. World eats the weak." Elara, steady at his side, binding spokes with twine, replied, "Strength without kindness is just another kind of hunger." He gave her a sidelong glance, surprised, then after a moment nodded as if tucking the thought away. Later she asked, "Why do you keep fighting this land? Because if I don't, it takes everything. Already took my wife." He paused, swallowing hard. A man's got to fight back or he's nothing. Elara set down the basin she was carrying. "And a woman. What she got?" Silas looked at her for a long time, then said, "Depends on the woman." It wasn't tenderness, not yet, but it was honesty. And in honesty they began to build something sturdier than stone. Then one evening Elara's hands faltered as she kneaded bread. She pressed her palm to her stomach, lips parting in shock. Weeks later, the truth was certain. She was carrying a child. Silas stared at her when she told him, the weight of the news heavy in his silence. For a long time he said nothing. Finally he stepped closer, laid his massive hand gently over hers, and whispered, "Then this ain't just a contract anymore." For the first time since the fire, Elara smiled, but peace never lasts long on barren land. Cade Holt returned with more than words. It was a moonless night when the smoke reached their window. Silas jolted awake, grabbed his boots, and rushed outside. Flames licked along the fence line, hungry and spreading fast. "Elara, stay inside," he barked. But she was already at the pump gown, clinging to her legs as she hauled buckets. "This is my home, too," she cried, defiance blazing in her eyes. Cade's laughter carried from the dark. "Pretty picture giant and nun playing house. Won't last. Fire'll see to that." Silas grabbed a shovel, beating back the sparks. "Face me, Holt!" he roared. But Cade didn't step forward. He circled in the shadows, throwing insults, waiting for weakness. The fire crackled higher. Then Elara's voice cut through. "The barn, if the fire takes it, the cattle go next." Silas pivoted, shielded her as she dashed with water toward the blaze. Side by side they fought, Silas striking, Elara dousing, moving as though born to the same rhythm. At last Cade showed himself, pistol in hand. He raised it, grinning. Before Silas could move, Elara hurled a bucket water, splashing into Cade's eyes. He cursed, fired wild into the night. Silas charged, one hand knocking the pistol free, the other closing around Cade's throat. "I ought to end you," Silas growled. Elara's hand touched his arm. "Don't!" For a heartbeat, Silas trembled with rage. Then with a shove, he threw Cade into the dirt. "You come back," Silas said, voice like gravel, "and you won't walk away." Cade staggered to his horse and fled. Silas stood panting, chest heaving, flames dying around them. Elara dropped her bucket, tears streaking through the soot on her face. "I wasn't afraid of him," she whispered. "I was afraid because for the first time I've found faith again. If you believe vows mean more than contracts, leave a comment. I'd love to know what you think. And like this video if you think Elara's courage deserves to be remembered." Silas turned to her, frowning. Faith in what her eyes met his fierce and tender all at once. "In you." The words hit harder than any fire. Silas, the man who had asked for nothing but a daughter, felt something shift in the marrow of his bones. For the first time he reached for her, not out of duty, not out of need, but because he wanted to. And when their foreheads touched in the glow of dying embers, the silence between them finally broke, not with words, but with the truth of love beginning to take root. The Callahan ranch stood blackened at the edges, but unbroken. Inside its stone walls, two souls who had once been strangers now carried something greater than survival. They carried each other, and within Ilara's womb a legacy stirred, one born not of contract but of covenant. The fire had not broken them. If anything, it had forged them. Out of smoke and ashes, Silas and Ilara had stood together, and from that night on, their bond was no longer a contract written on paper, but a vow carved into bone and spirit. And soon the storm they had weathered together would bring forth new life. The winter that followed was brutal. Winds howled through the cracks, snow fell thick and endless, yet in the Callahan house there was warmth. Ilara's belly grew round her steps slower, but her eyes glowed with a fierce calm Silas had never seen before. When the labor came, it came with thunder. A storm rattled the windows, lightning splitting the prairie sky. Ilara screamed once, gripping Silas's hand until his knuckles cracked. He worked like a soldier under command, boiling water, laying towels, holding her when she shook with pain. And at 3 a.m, beneath the lantern's light, their daughter arrived, red-faced, hollering against the world like the storm outside. Ilara gathered the child to her chest, tears streaking her cheeks. "She came," she whispered. "She came anyway." Silas stared down at the tiny bundle, his hand dwarfing her entire body. He bent low, pressed his lips to her head. "We'll call her June," he said, "for the warmth we never thought we'd feel again." Ilara nodded, voice trembling, "And she will be both strong as you, gentle as I. That is our vow. Life did not become easier, it never did on the Wyoming plains, but it became fuller. Silas worked the land, but now with purpose that burned steadier than hunger. He was not just building fences, he was building a home. He was not just raising cattle, he was raising a future." Ilara turned the stone house into a sanctuary. She planted herbs along the windowsill, filled the rooms with warmth and music, her voice untrained but joyous. She read to June by firelight stories of saints and soldiers, teaching her that faith and strength were not enemies but kin. June grew quickly, taller than most children, dark-eyed like her father, yet with her mother's quiet grace. She learned to ride before she could read, and she learned to pray before she could shoot. In her, the two worlds of Silas and Ilara twined together like roots and branches. The townsfolk still whispered, "That girl's too wild, don't smile like other girls, don't bow her head." But June didn't care. Each night before she closed her eyes, her mother whispered, "The world fears girls who don't flinch," and June whispered back, "Then I'll never flinch." Time, however, is a thief, even strong hands can't hold back. One spring morning, Ilara sat in her favorite chair by the window. Sunlight streamed across her lap, a book resting open but unread. When Silas entered, calling her name, she did not stir. She was gone as gently as a candle flame sighing into the dark. Silas knelt at her side, took her hand, and whispered, "I'm still here." His tears did not come quickly, but when they did, they came like rain after drought, heavy and cleansing. They buried her beneath the wild sunflowers she had planted years before, where the wind always seemed to sing. The stone marker bore only her name, and beneath it Silas carved with his own hands the storm they could not break. From then on, the house felt quieter. Not empty, never empty, not with June, but quieter. Silas carried on not out of habit, but out of devotion. Each board he mended, each calf he delivered was a prayer for the woman he had lost and the child she had left him. On the morning of her 18th birthday, June rode back from the ridge where the land met the horizon. Silas was on the porch, older now, beard streaked with gray eyes, softer but still sharp. She dismounted, stood before him with the wind tugging at her hair. "Daddy," she said, "I'm leaving tomorrow." He didn't flinch. He had seen this day coming. "I want to learn," she said, "to teach, to fight for something bigger than just this land. I'll come back, but I need to see the world with my own eyes." Silas nodded slowly. "Your mama would be proud." June's eyes filled, but she smiled. "I love you, Daddy." He rose, towering still, and pulled her into his arms. His voice was hushed, steady as always. "I never needed a strong daughter, but God, I'm glad I got one." The next morning, Silas stood beneath the carved gate Callahan Ridge and watched her ride off, dust trailing behind her. His heart ached, but it was not the ache of loss. It was the ache of fulfillment, the ache of knowing he had kept his vow. And as the wind swept across the barren land, he could almost hear Alara's voice again, raise her not to flinch. Silas whispered back, "We did." The prairie was still harsh, storms still came, and men like Cade Holt's kin still cast shadows on the land. But Silas no longer feared being alone, for he knew the legacy he and Alara had built was not just in acres of grassland or walls of stone, but in the strength of a daughter forged by storm and steadied by love. And in that legacy, the barren land was no longer barren. It was alive. If this ending touched your heart, please subscribe so you never miss another story of faith, love, and resilience. Tell me in the comments, would you have the strength to keep such a vow? And don't forget to like this video so more people can discover these powerful tales. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.